Thank you, Jayanta. And let me start by thanking President Chandrika Kumartanga, as well as SAPRI and Indrajit for inviting me to this conference. Having lived and worked in Sri Lanka for many years, it's really wonderful to see a Sri Lankan institute making its presence felt in Delhi. And I hope that this will, as I think Pratap said in the morning, lead to a trend where we actually do show up institutionally, not individually, as people representing institutions in each other's capitals. So I'm going to talk about the way in which service delivery in our part of the world has moved. And I'm also going to take advantage of the presence of President Utim, as well as my good friend Priyanti, to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka and Mauritius in terms of how South Asia compares both with a South Asian member as well as a advanced middle-income African country. The messages that I want to share with you first relate to a work that I did along with other colleagues at the World Bank when I was at the World Bank, the World Development Report for 2004, which talked about making services work for poor people. I'll use that as a framework to think about the unfinished agenda in South Asia. I'll talk a little bit about where we still have that unfinished agenda and what the depth and breadth of that unfinished agenda is. As I said, I'll refer to some middle-income lessons within our neighborhood, in particular to Sri Lanka and Mauritius. And following Pratap's admonition or urging in the beginning at the morning, I'll talk about the politics of service delivery as well. Very quickly, just going over the World Development Report for 2004, it asked the question, how can services work for poor people? And it answered that question by referring to an accountability framework where it urged clients or poor people to monitor and discipline service providers, to use politics to be able to express their voice, and by strengthening the incentives for service providers. And the question that we'll come to is where we are 9 years on from that piece of work. I'm also going to, in a more light-hearted vein, use some illustrations by a favorite cartoonist of mine, R.K. Lakshman. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with India's foremost political cartoonist. He's also perhaps one of the foremost observers of the state of service delivery in our part of the world. And I won't talk about them, but you'll see how he has made such pungent observations about the status of service delivery in our part of the world. So why are we concerned? Here's somebody mentioned I think Jayanta mentioned the Millennium Development Goals at the beginning of this session. And if you look at this chart, it shows you the percentage of indicators that are on track relative to indicators for which data are available. Bangladesh, amongst the South Asian countries, is the lead, but the rest are very, very far behind. And it's quite clear that in many instances for the MDGs, most of the countries of the region will be only able to perhaps attain half of the MDGs by the year 2015. I'm going to spend a little time on India because that's the country I know the best. I actually do know Bangladesh and Sri Lanka very well too, having worked on them extensively, but India is the most depressing story in some sense. Here's a graph showing you kids in school who are not able to read, standard 5 children who can't read at level standard 2. And note that the incidence of this functional illiteracy is actually increasing over time. And government schools, of which there are many, and which are supposed to cater to the poor, are actually showing a worse performance than private schools. For arithmetic or maths, the same problem. Percentage of children in standard 5 who can't do simple division. So there are many such instances, and this, by the way, comes from work done by ASAR, perhaps even more telling in today's world, here's a graph showing you the performance of males in the working ages by the year of birth, showing the percentage who are college graduates and those who are fluent speakers of English. And unfortunately, the white line showing you the percentage of speakers who are fluent in English is declining, even as the number of graduates or the incidence of graduates is increasing, which is really telling for a country that is preparing itself or is already immersed in global competition. I'll end with one last piece of statistic that has recently become available from what's called the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, showing you a benchmark for 15-year-olds. PISA measures not only what students know, but it also measures what students can do with that knowledge. And for the first time after many years, India acceded to the request to do PISA benchmarking in India and offered two states, Himachal Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. Unfortunately, both states came out at the very end of the 74 countries that were tested, next only to Kyrgyzstan. I have some more detailed information on this. I won't spend time on it, but here's a chart that shows you comparisons of Tamil Nadu and Himachal Pradesh versus the economic superstars, the current superpowers, and the rising superpowers. And you notice that the average for Himachal Pradesh and Tamil Nadu compared to the average for the others that are listed here is way off. Even if you compare the best, the 95th percentile for Himachal Pradesh and Tamil Nadu compared to the 95th percentile, obviously it is far worse. So that here's a country that is wanting to be globally competitive in services, which is very knowledge intensive, and yet is way off what the current superstars or the emerging powers are able to do. This does not bode well for something that was talked about quite a bit, has been talked about quite a bit in the context of India. Shahid talked about it in the context of Pakistan, the demographic dividend. So here's India's population triangle in 2010, the way the bulge will start moving up through the distribution by 2030. And the big challenge for India is the way in which it's going to be able to use the very favorable ratio of working age to non-working age population. And you can see that in this particular graph, where the green lines show possible ratios for working and non-working age populations for India, depending on the fertility rate that you assume, relative to the red line, which is East Asia's. So that India has this dramatic potential to do well and earn this demographic dividend. But as we've heard, the demographic dividend can easily turn to a demographic disaster as this bulge moves up through the age population, the population pyramid, and if these workers are not productive and do not save enough, then we end up with the disaster where we have a bulge of senior citizens who need a lot of medical care, who need the kinds of expenditures that a society can only bear if it has accumulated wealth along the way. So that situations like this, where the female participation ratio in India compared to China is so much lower, can be a huge dampener to earning that demographic dividend. So these are some of the reasons why I think it's important to worry about where service delivery is taking us and what we have attained so far. I'll just end with one little slide showing you how, I think this is a point that was also made earlier today, that labor productivity cannot be increased in a matter of a month, a year, or 2 years, or 5 years. It requires a whole series of steps that have to start with primary school, that have to then go on to moving through secondary, building vocational skills, encouraging entrepreneurship and labor market reform, of which we also heard this morning, so that it requires a whole series of coordinated steps to be able to increase labor productivity, and this does not happen overnight. So let's look at two middle-income countries, one almost middle-income, Sri Lanka and Mauritius, to see what they have done and how they have managed. And we know Sri Lanka's experience with very high human development indicators. High literacy rates, low child and maternal mortality, life expectancy, which is comparable to firmly established middle-income and upper-income countries like Turkey, Mexico, and Malaysia. And indeed, Sri Lanka has no other country with lower infant mortality and lower per capita income. If you graph the two, it is right there at the very bottom. Quite a remarkable achievement. And as I think Lee Kuan Yew famously observed, when I went to Colombo for the first time in 1956, it was a better city than Singapore in the 1950s. Of course, Singapore today has a per capita GDP that is about 20 times higher than that of Sri Lanka's. And so then the question that arises is why, despite this healthy population, this highly educated population, has Sri Lanka performed below potential? Some of the reasons for this, and here I'm going to be running somewhat orthogonal or contrary to President Utim's talk about free education. In Sri Lanka also, the government, which is the majority provider of education, there are very few official private schools, and it is free. It has generated exceptional first-generation outcomes in enrollment, literacy, child, maternal mortality that we saw. But at the same time, only 33% of primary school students have a knowledge of their own language or arithmetic, only 10% of English, and there are big jumps in non-communicable diseases. Why? Because state provision and public campaigns can eliminate things like malaria, but not non-communicable diseases that require behavior change, that require health insurance to be able to deal with it for a society as a whole. Learning, as opposed to enrollment, requires classroom flexibility, teacher autonomy, and the ability of parents to hold teachers accountable for actual learning outcomes as opposed to simply enrollment in schools. So in some sense, this system that Sri Lanka has built so successfully that has generated such fantastic human development indicators at low per capita incomes is now not that well suited to tackle second-generation problems. And in a sense, Sri Lanka's system becomes a victim of its own success because it creates entrenched interests, such as, for example, labor unions or teacher unions. Let's turn to Mauritius. As President Utim said, universal primary enrollment has achieved tremendous gains in access and gender parity fairly soon after independence in 1968. At the same time, however, the failure rate of the certificate for primary education is about 31% in Mauritius as compared to 2% in Singapore. So that there is an issue here of being able to enroll students, but then how many of them are moving on to secondary school or to vocational education. There's also a problem because of the rapid transformation of the economy, as President Utim mentioned, from a monocrop agricultural economy to a service-led, knowledge-based economy with textile exports. There is now a growing skills mismatch and a rising unemployment rate that is sapping Mauritius's tremendous growth potential. Of course, Mauritius being Mauritius, with progressive leadership, of which, of course, President Utim is an example, has already begun work on a 10-year vision for tertiary education. And indeed, one of the strategies that it is going to employ is to be able to have foreign students come in for education so that it will start exporting education services as well, and that way build its own capacity to deal with the skill mismatch. But here are examples. A first-generation success with free universal primary education, other kinds of state provision can indeed lead to problems. And